Welcome to this explainer. Right now, we're stepping into one of the most brutal and honestly strategically fascinating conflicts of the 20th century. We're looking at the Chaco War, fought between Bolivia and Paraguay from 1932 to 1935. And we're approaching this with the absolute seriousness of a military documentary today because, well, this wasn't just some minor border skirmish. It's a terrifying, almost laboratory-perfect case study of how intangible factors, things like leadership, doctrine, and on-the-fly adaptation, can completely crush overwhelming material superiority. So buckle up. We're about to conduct a strategic autopsy on a war that defied literally all expectations.
Here is the roadmap for our forensic analysis today. First, the impossible victory. Then we'll look at the green hell, the clash between Estigarribia and Kundt, the clashing doctrines, the logistical collapse, and finally, the timeless lessons of the Chaco.
So let's dive right into Phase 1, an impossible victory and the illusion of metrics. Okay, put yourself in the shoes of an intelligence analyst looking at the pre-war expectations back in 1932. Absolutely everyone, and I mean everyone, assumed a Bolivian victory was mathematically inevitable. It really seemed like simple accounting, right? Just look at the stark contrast here. Bolivia had triple the population. Their military budget was just massively inflated by all this wealth from tin exports, which meant they could buy the absolute latest European tanks, planes, and heavy artillery. Paraguay, meanwhile, they were working with scavenged resources and a fraction of the manpower. On paper, this wasn't even a war, it was a formality. But the planners who believed this committed the original sin of strategic analysis. They believed that raw resources are identical to actual military power. They just completely ignored the realities of geography, the weight of morale, and the agility of leadership.
Which brings us to Phase 2, the green hell, the battlefield itself.
Because the second you look at the theater of war, it completely invalidates all those mathematical advantages. They call the Gran Chaco the green hell, and let me tell you, that is not a poetic exaggeration. We're talking about an endless ocean of thorny scrubland under crushing oppressive heat. But the most terrifying aspect? The almost total lack of water. There were no defined European-style fronts out here, no neat paved roads. Trying to apply European rules of war in this environment was just an absolute recipe for disaster. This was a labyrinth. Nature itself was a lethal enemy here, and often it was far more dangerous than the soldiers standing across from you.
Moving on to Phase 3, Estigarribia versus Kundt, the clash of commanders.
To really understand how both sides handled this absolute nightmare, we have to look at the men giving the orders. And this contrast, it's the core of the entire conflict. On the Paraguayan side, you have General José Félix Estigarribia. Now, he wasn't your typical charismatic, fiery general. He was a meticulous, incredibly pragmatic thinker. He used a mission command philosophy that he actually learned from French academies. Plus, his mindset was deeply shaped by Paraguay's historical trauma from the War of the Triple Alliance. That history taught them how to fight when literally everything is stacked against you. Opposing him was Bolivia's commander, General Hans Kundt, who was an imported German officer. Kundt was dogmatic. He was rigid. He operated strictly on Prussian doctrine, demanding blind, millimeter-perfect obedience from his subordinates. And in a vast, unmapped wilderness, that rigid style completely paralyzed his forces. And this brilliantly illustrates the genius of Estigarribia. He didn't waste his energy trying to eliminate the chaos of the Chaco. He understood that chaos wasn't a bug, it was the natural state of this war. So rather than fighting the chaos, he surfed it. He exploited the environment and turned it into his primary weapon. Whereas Kundt, well, Kundt just saw the terrain as an annoying obstacle to his textbooks.
Let's look at Phase 4, the clash of doctrines, mass versus maneuver.
So how did these wildly different leadership philosophies actually translate onto the ground? Well, Bolivia blindly relied on the Prussian doctrine. This is a military system highly optimized for the flat plains of Europe. It relies on strict discipline, massive troop formations, and concentrated artillery fire to achieve total annihilation. But there is a massive, glaring flaw when you try to bring this to South America. It assumes a battlefield with wheat fields, open sightlines, and established roads. None of that existed in a Chaco. Zero. Kundt was essentially trying to solve a problem of wilderness survival using an engineering manual for European highways. It just wasn't going to work. And what followed was the ultimate display of tactical jujitsu. Kundt, who was really trapped by his own ego and his past successes, stubbornly tried to adapt the Chaco to his doctrine. He ordered his men to undergo this agonizing, insanely expensive labor of building linear roads, just so his European tanks and artillery could roll forward.
Paraguay did the exact opposite. They adapted their doctrine to the Chaco. Estigarribia would actually just sit back and let the Bolivians exhaust themselves building these massive roads in the heat. He'd wait for them to advance and then send his light infantry slipping right through the supposedly impenetrable thorny brush to encircle and trap the Bolivians from behind, using the very roads the Bolivians had just built.
Phase 5, the logistical collapse, or the tyranny of distance.
Now, even the smartest tactics in the world fail without supplies, which brings us to the ultimate, decisive factor of this war, logistics. Because at the end of the day, military doctrine is absolutely useless if you cannot deliver water and bullets to the front line. 800. Just pause and think about that terrifying number for a second. 800 kilometers. That is the distance from the Bolivian supply hubs high up in the Andean highlands, sitting at 4,000 meters of altitude, all the way down into the scorching, unmapped plains of the Chaco. What we're looking at here is the anatomy of a self-consuming supply chain. Supplies started out on trains high up in the mountains. Then they were transferred to trucks, which, unsurprisingly, rapidly broke down on the rugged descent. Then they were loaded onto mules, which ended up dying of thirst in the extreme heat. So finally, the burden fell to exhausted soldiers physically carrying crates on their backs. It perfectly illustrates the iron law of war. Your logistical vulnerability doesn't just increase linearly the further you go, it increases exponentially. Bolivia was literally devoting massive amounts of their own supplies just to feed the animals carrying the supplies. And the human cost of this failure? It was beyond horrific. There are documented accounts of Bolivian soldiers forced to drink their own urine just to survive. Entire units were surrendering, not because they were out of ammo or outfought, but because they were quite literally dying of thirst. Bolivia was fighting two fronts simultaneously, the Paraguayan army and the tyranny of distance, and they were losing both. It just proves that logistics is not some secondary support function. Logistics is the war itself. Finally, Phase 6, the lessons of the Chaco. Let's summarize this strategic autopsy. So, what are the timeless military lessons we can extract from the blood and dust of the Gran Chaco? Just look at how Paraguay's internally coherent system systematically neutralized every single disconnected, on-paper advantage that Bolivia possessed. Where Bolivia was rigid, Paraguay was flexible. Where Bolivia focused on head-on attrition, Paraguay focused on maneuver. And most importantly, where Bolivia viewed the savage environment as an enemy to be conquered, Paraguay turned that environment into their most lethal weapon. It was a complete, top-to-bottom conceptual victory over material superiority. There's this old military saying that serves as the haunting epitaph of this conflict. The war was won by the soldier who knew where to find water. It's incredibly powerful, and it reinforces a timeless truth. Despite modern technology, despite the tanks, the planes, and the massive budgets, war is ultimately decided by fundamental human realities, logistical constraints, and pragmatic adaptation. I want to leave you with this lingering thought today. The Chaco War wasn't just a historical event. It was an early warning system for the 20th and 21st centuries. We have seen this exact pattern repeat itself in modern asymmetric conflicts over and over again. Highly advanced militaries marching in with overwhelming tech, completely misunderstanding the local culture, the geography, and the sheer willpower of their rival. So as our technology continues to advance at light speed, we really have to ask ourselves, how many more times will we fall into the exact same trap of confusing material wealth with true strategic power? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking the tough questions and always look beyond the metrics.